Imagine you've lost everything. Not some things, everything. Your children, your health, your home, the life you built, gone in a single day. And you're sitting in the ash, alone. That's where we meet Job. He doesn't understand what happened. He has no explanation, no map, no reason. But here's what most people miss about Job. He doesn't go silent. He doesn't pretend to be okay. He looks up at the sky and starts talking to God. Not politely, not carefully, honestly. And that one moment, a broken man refusing to let go, is where part 3 begins. This is the final part of our series. We started with Abraham, a man who received a promise he couldn't see fulfilled in his lifetime. We followed David, a shepherd king who carried that promise through war and failure and grief. And now we arrive at the longest, hardest stretch of the story, from Job to Malachi, where the promise doesn't shine, it cries out. But before we go further, stay with me here because this matters. The question this entire section is asking is the same question millions of people are asking right now. Does suffering mean the promise is broken? Job didn't do anything wrong. That's the detail the book makes very clear very early. He was faithful, he was careful, he was generous, and then everything collapsed anyway. And the theological debate his friends offer him, you must have sinned, God is punishing you, just confess, sounds reasonable. It sounds like what religious people are supposed to say. But God, at the end of the book, looks at those friends and says, you didn't speak what is right, the way Job did. Job's honesty was more acceptable to God than his friends' polished theology. That is the first hidden thread of this section. Honesty before God, even angry, confused, painful honesty, is not disrespect. It's relationship. And then, in the middle of all that darkness, Job says something that stops you cold. I know that my Redeemer lives, from Job 19, verse 25. Not I hope, not I think, not maybe if I'm good enough. He says, I know, from the ash, from the ruins of his life, a certainty that has no logical explanation. And that sentence echoes forward through the entire Old Testament like a signal fire.
The promise was never just about land or a nation. It was always moving toward a person. 1,000 years before the cross, David sat alone, probably at night, probably exhausted, and wrote a poem that described something he had never experienced. A man surrounded by enemies, his hands and feet pierced, people dividing his clothing, crying out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's Psalm 22, and if you've read the New Testament, you recognize every line. David wasn't just writing about his feelings. Something moved through him that he couldn't fully understand himself. The promise was starting to take shape, not in history yet, but in poetry, in pain, in a song written by a man who didn't know what he was seeing. This is where everything changes. The promise is no longer just a direction. It's beginning to look like a face. 700 years before the 1st century, a prophet named Isaiah sat down and wrote one of the strangest passages in the entire Old Testament. He described a servant, someone who would suffer, someone despised and rejected, someone who would carry the pain of others, someone wounded, not for his own wrongdoing, but for everyone else's. Quote, "He was pierced for our transgressions." Isaiah 53, verse 5. No name, no date, just a portrait, drawn 7 centuries before the person it described was born. If Job gave us the emotional cry, "My Redeemer lives," Isaiah gave us the outline, the shape of someone coming, someone who would not just deliver the promise from a distance, but absorb the full weight of human suffering from the inside. One idea at a time. Let that land. The promise, the one whispered in a garden in Genesis 3, was always headed toward a moment where it would take on flesh, enter the pain, and not escape it. Job sat in the ash and held on. David wept in the dark and wrote what he couldn't explain. Isaiah drew a portrait of someone he would never meet. And none of them knew they were describing the same person. Jeremiah had one job: tell the truth. He did it for 40 years, and for 40 years, nobody listened. He wasn't dramatic about it. He wasn't angry or aggressive. He just kept showing up. City gates, temple courts, royal palaces, and saying the same thing in different ways. This path leads to destruction. Turn back. And the people smiled and walked past him. The priests dismissed him. The kings ignored him. One of them actually took his written scroll, cut it into pieces, and threw it into a fire, section by section, while Jeremiah watched. And then it happened. Everything he said would happen, happened. Jerusalem fell. The temple burned. The people were taken into exile. The city that had stood for 4 centuries, gone. Jeremiah sat in the rubble of everything he had warned about and watched it burn. And here's what most people miss. In that moment, in the lowest, darkest, most destroyed moment of his entire life, Jeremiah wrote the most hope-filled lines in the Old Testament. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new every morning. Lamentations 3, verses 22-23. Not from comfort, not from a mountaintop experience, from ruins, from ash, from a city that was still smoking. This is the pattern this entire section keeps showing you. The promise doesn't survive because circumstances are good. It survives because something in the human soul, even a shattered one, refuses to let it go. A few decades later, 3 young men stood in front of a furnace. Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, were told to bow to an empire's idol or burn. And they said something remarkable. They said, "Our God is able to save us, but even if he doesn't, we still won't bow." Stay with me here, because this is not just a dramatic story. This is the promise being carried in a completely hostile world. Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem. The exile had scattered God's people. By every external measurement, the promise looked finished. And yet, 3 young men, alone in a foreign empire, under threat of death, held the line. The promise doesn't need favorable conditions to survive. It has never needed favorable conditions to survive. That's the whole point. And then we reach the last book, the last prophet, the last voice before a silence that would last 400 years. Malachi. His name means "my messenger," and his message is uncomfortable. The people have grown tired. Their worship has become routine. Their offerings are half-hearted. They're going through the motions of faith while their hearts are somewhere else entirely. And God, through Malachi, says something that sounds like both a warning and a promise at the same time. "I will send my messenger, who will prepare the way before me." Malachi 3, verse 1. And the very last lines of the very last chapter of the very last book of the Old Testament speak of Elijah coming, a voice before the voice, a signal that something is finally arriving. And then, silence. 400 years of it. No prophet, no burning bush, no angelic visit, no dream, no vision, just silence. A people waiting, a promise that hadn't spoken in centuries. Now, step back. Look at the full arc we've traveled. A garden, a whisper. Someone is coming who will undo this. Abraham packs his bags for a land he's never seen, carrying a promise he'll never see completed. David writes songs in the dark that describe a suffering he doesn't understand.
Job holds on from the ash with nothing left but the words, "I know my Redeemer lives." Isaiah draws a portrait of a suffering servant 7 centuries before he exists. Jeremiah watches everything collapse and writes, "His mercies are new every morning." And Malachi closes the book, puts down the pen, and the world waits. 400 years of silence. And then, in a small town, in a stable, with no announcement that the empire noticed, a child was born. And Genesis 3:15, the promise that had survived a flood, a famine, slavery, exile, silence, and 4,000 years of human failure, finally had a name. The promise didn't just survive, it arrived. If you've made it this far, here's the one thing I want you to carry with you. The promise was never fragile. You just didn't know the whole story yet. And now you do. The full series, The One Promise God Made and Kept Over 4,000 Years, is complete. If this opens something for you, share it with someone who's still sitting in the ash. They need to hear that the promise hasn't forgotten them either.